It began Thursday night where the Bills faced off against the Dolphins. Starting off with the Bills, it was the James Cook show all the way. Cook racking up 95 total yards and 2 touchdowns. Josh Allen didn't do a whole lot with 139 yards and 1 touchdown, but they ended up winning 31-10, so I guess it works. Moving on to the Dolphins, Tua got yet again another concussion and has to decide if he should retire at 26 or keep playing and risk turning into Antonio Brown if he gets hit in the head again. Before Tua's brain turned to mush, he wasn't playing very well, racking up 145 yards and 1 touchdown and 3 interceptions on a 68% completion rate. However, the sophomore year standout star Devon Achane had 22 carries for 96 yards and 7 catches for 69 yards and a touchdown. He basically placed the team on his back, but it wasn't enough for the win. Waddle had 4 catches for 41 yards and Tyreek with 3 catches for 24 yards. They didn't contribute much. To be fair, they were playing with backup Skylar Thompson for half the game. Moving on, the 49ers played the Vikings, and the Vikings won 23-17. Starting off with the Vikings, Sam Darnold looks to be in his prime, putting up 268 yards and 2 touchdowns with an interception. He no longer is seeing ghosts on the field, so that's a plus. Ty Chandler seems to be making some progress also, with 10 touches for 82 yards, averaging 8.2 yards per carry, which is insanely impressive considering the 49ers have one of the best defenses in the NFL. And in the air, Justin Jefferson did Justin Jefferson things, racking up 133 yards on 4 catches and a touchdown, including a 97-yard touchdown. Moving on to the 49ers, they just ran the ball with Jordan Mason almost the entire time. He ended up with 20 touches for 100 yards and a touchdown. Honorable mention to Deebo Samuel, who had 110 yards and 8 catches. Next up, we have the Bucs and the Lions, with Tampa Bay pulling off yet another upset this week. Tampa Bay played very well against the electric Lions team, and the standout star for this game was Chris Godwin with 7 catches for 117 yards and a touchdown. Baker did alright with 185 yards and a touchdown, but he did get picked off once. However, he did well on the ground with 34 yards and a touchdown, including the longest touchdown of his career, which was a 12-yard run. Other than that, Mike Evans did okay with 3 catches for 42 yards, but it wasn't anything crazy. Bucky Irving also got some reps with 7 touches for 22 yards, leaving the Bucs running backs. Jared Goff had a rough game with 307 yards and 2 picks. Jahmyr Gibbs led the backfield with 13 rushes for 84 yards. And in the receiving game, he managed to snag 7 catches for 22 yards. Amon-Ra St. Brown had a good game himself with 11 catches for 119 yards, and he looked to be back to his old self. Laporta really struggled last week, and this week was no different. He was just held to 2 catches for 13 yards. Our next game is Jets versus Titans. Rodgers looked good with 176 yards and 2 touchdowns, and the running back duo of Breece Hall and Braylon Allen is going to be scary going forward. Breece ended with 14 touches for 62 yards, and Allen with 7 rushes for 33 yards and a touchdown. Both Breece and Braylon looked phenomenal in the receiving game, with Breece having 7 catches for 52 yards and a TD, and Braylon having 2 catches for 23 yards and the second touchdown of the day. Garrett Wilson led the receivers with a whopping 57 yards. Overall, the Jets are looking pretty good and pretty put together. Moving on to the Titans, Mayonnaise boy Will Levis had an extremely mediocre game with 192 yards and a touchdown with an interception. Pollard led the backfield with 62 yards, and Ridley had 77 yards on 4 catches and a touchdown on the ground and in the air. Overall, this team has some bright spots, but a long way to go. The next game was the Chargers versus the Panthers. I'm not going to talk about this one for long, mainly because the Panthers lost 26-3. Bryce Young is getting benched after the game for Andy Dalton, and the Chargers just ran the ball down their throat 44 times. Moving on to the Seahawks Patriots, this game ended up going into overtime, and the Seahawks won 23-20. Seattle had a good game with Geno throwing 327 yards and a touchdown. On the ground, Zach Charbonnet had 14 rushes for 38 yards and a touchdown, but the player of the game was DK Metcalf, racking up 129 yards on 10 catches and a TD. JSN also had a good game with 117 yards and 2 catches. Overall, this team looks really good, and I wouldn't be surprised if they won their division with how the 49ers struggled. New England had an okay game with Jacoby Brissett, throwing for 150 yards and a touchdown. On the ground, Stevenson had 21 rushes for 81 yards and a TD, and in the air, Hunter Henry had 8 catches for 109 yards, leading the team. There's not a lot of bright spots in New England, but they're doing alright with what they have. The Packers played the Colts at home, and the Loveless Packers held their own, winning 16-10. While it wasn't the flashiest game or the highest scoring, Malik Willis did well, with Jordan Love out, putting up 122 yards and 1 TD, completing 12 for 14 attempts in the air. Josh Jacobs went off for 151 yards in 32 attempts. No one really did exceptional in the receiving room, but Dobbs did lead the team with 62 yards on 3 catches. Shout out to Eric Wilson, Evan Williams, and Xavier McKinney for each getting a pick. The Packers look pretty good even without their star quarterback. However, the Colts looked like a dumpster fire, with Anthony Richardson throwing for 200 yards and a touchdown, but 3 interceptions. Jonathan Taylor had a respectable 103 yards with 12 attempts. Normally, I would shout out a receiver, but they all did terrible. None of them topped 60 yards, and only one managed to get 5 receptions. This game was a big step back for the Colts. I will give a shout out to Leatu Latu for forcing a fumble, though. Next up is the Browns versus the Jags. The Browns won 18-13. It was a battle of the mid-off, and Deshaun Watson looked pretty rough, going for 186 yards on 64% completion rate. Ford led the ground game with 7 rushes for 64 yards, and Jeudy led the air with 5 catches for 73 yards. Jerry Jeudy seems to be fitting nicely with this new team, and I'm pretty proud of him for that. Moving on to the Jags, Trevor Lawrence wasn't much better with 220 yards on only 46% completion. ETN looks alright with 13 rushes for 52 yards and a touchdown on the ground. The real star of this game was Brian Thomas Jr., the rookie with 2 catches for 94 yards. He seems to already cement himself as the wide receiver 1 2 weeks into the new season. Our next game, the Ravens played the Raiders at home and lost 26-23. A huge win for the Raiders and a massive bounce back from week 1 where they lost to the Chargers. Gardner Minshew had 280 yards and both a pick and a touchdown, but it was enough to get the job done. The ground game was horrid, with Zamir White leading with only 9 rushes for 24 yards. Devontae Adams had himself a nice game with 9 catches for 110 yards and a touchdown, and so did Brock Bowers, who also had 9 catches for 98 yards. The Ravens, however, did not perform well, are now at the bottom of their division. Lamar had 247 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 pick, and Henry rushed for 84 yards on 16 attempts. Zay Flowers ended the game with 7 catches for 91 yards and a touchdown. The worst part about this game is the Ravens actually didn't play that bad, and they still fell to one of the worst teams in the league. They need a bounce-back game against the Cowboys next week to bring up their morale. I think the most surprising game was the Saints beating the Cowboys 44-19. I don't know what they're putting in Derek Carr's water this season, but they should keep doing it. Statistically, best quarterback in the last 2 weeks by far, putting up 243 yards and 2 touchdowns with an interception. But the most impressive player on the field was hands down Alvin Kamara with 4 touchdowns, 3 on the ground and 1 in the air, and 115 yards rushing with 65 receiving. He was unstoppable in this game. Rashid Shaheed also looked good in the second week in a row, putting up 96 yards on 4 grabs and a touchdown. Moving on over to the Cowboys, what happened? Dak ended with 293 yards with 1 touchdown and 2 picks, and nearly every offensive player wasn't even worth mentioning, except CeeDee Lamb, with 90 yards and 4 catches and a touchdown. On the defensive end, Donovan Wilson had himself a nice game with 6 tackles and a pick, but other than that, everyone else was very disappointing. The Giants played the Commanders, and believe it or not, Danny Dimes actually looked good, and they still lost 21-18. The Giants have completely lost hope after watching their quarterback finally throw for 2 touchdowns and 180 yards just to lose by 3 to one of the worst teams in the NFL. Singletary had a nice game on the ground with 95 yards and a touchdown on 16 attempts, and the rookie Malik Neighbors had a huge game with 127 yards and 10 catches along with the touchdown. I don't know what the Giants have to change at this point, but it has to be something. And on the Commanders side, Jaden Daniels wasn't that great with 226 yards and no touchdowns. He did have 44 yards on the ground, which was nice, but Brian Robinson balled out with 133 yards on 17 rushing attempts. And while there was no great receiver, Zach Ertz had a nice game with 4 catches for 62 yards. The Commanders are slowly building some momentum for this NFL season. Next up, we got the Rams and the Cardinals. Honestly, I feel bad for the Rams. They got blown out 41-10. Pretty much with Kupp out now, the only stud players are Stafford and Kyron Williams. Stafford threw for 216 yards and Kyron rushed for only 25 yards on 12 attempts. But he did have a touchdown. To be honest, there was no leading receiver since Kupp went down and Puka was out, so the rest of the receivers kind of sucked. But hopefully one of them can step up in the next coming week. And on the Cardinals side, everything went right. Kyler threw for 266 yards and 3 touchdowns, while MHJ dominated in the air with 130 yards and 4 catches in the first quarter. Oh, and he had 2 touchdowns to go along with that. James Conner ran up and down the field with 122 yards on 21 attempts and a TD. This game was everything the Cardinals wanted moving forward. Up next is the Steelers and Broncos. The Steelers won 13-6. I thought a lot about this one, and I've decided we're just going to skip the shout-out since literally every single player on both sides of the ball sucked, except Pat Surtain. The Chiefs played the Bengals and won 26-25. While the ending was a little controversial, the stats are not. Mahomes ended up putting up 151 yards and 2 picks to go along with 2 touchdowns. And a very interesting day from him. However, Pacheco had himself a nice game with 90 rushing yards off of 19 attempts. Rashid Rice led the receiving room with 1 touchdown and 75 yards with 5 catches, and Travis Kelce needs to remember how to catch the ball, only having 1 catch for 5 yards. Overall, the Chiefs looked good. Moving on to a healthy Joe Burrow-led Bengals, Burrow ended up with 158 yards and 2 touchdowns because he likes to keep his stats to be even numbers. I'm not going to shout out either of the running backs because they both sucked, and legendary Mike Gesicki led the team with 7 catches for 91 yards. Also, Andre Isovos had 2 catches for 7 yards and 2 touchdowns. Who the fuck is Andre Isovos? Anyway, Bengals don't look too bad and should bounce back next week. And for prime time, the Bears played the Texans and lost 19-13. Who would have thought the Bears would have lost? Me, after watching the painted nails man himself throw 2 picks. He also had 174 yards, so at least there's that. Instead of painting his nails, he should practice being a little more accurate. I don't hate the nails, but you gotta put up some touchdowns to start spending your free time doing other things. Other than that, the Bears offense didn't really have anyone that did well. Kevin Byard was probably the best Bears player on both sides, forcing a fumble. The Texans looked like how they did last year. A pretty solid all-around team. CJ Stroud threw 260 yards and a touchdown. The ground game just didn't happen, so no shout out there. And Nico Collins had 135 yards and 1 touchdown off of 8 catches, so props to him. And finally, moving on to our last game, the Monday night game. The Falcons beat the Eagles. Atlanta only needed 1 game to bring out Kirk Chainz. In this game, he had 241 yards and 2 tutties. Bijan looked like a force out there with 97 yards on 14 attempts, and Mooney led the team with 88 yards on 3 catches and a touchdown. The Falcons look pretty impressive this season. Finally, to finish it off, we have to talk about the Eagles. Hurts put up 85 yards on the ground and 183 in the air with a total of 2 touchdowns and 1 interception. Barkley looked good with 95 rushing yards on 22 attempts, and Devonta Smith led the receiving room with 76 yards and a touchdown off of 7 grabs. Eagles didn't play bad. They just played worse out of the 2 teams. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for my next video. Peace out.